I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Peggy Mauk. She is the Director of Agriculture Operations at UC Riverside, and she is also a specialist in subtropical horticulture. So Dr. Mauk is here today to build on what Dr. Crawley said and give a presentation on an evaluation of avocado rootstocks for salinity tolerance. So, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great opportunity to bring what we've been doing in the field to look at rootstocks to you guys, to have a little bit of a view of what we're doing and the hope that there is in the future. This is a trial that has evolved over time, and you'll see the different how it has evolved as we go through this. David's presentation is just a perfect backdrop to the research that he and I and Mary Lou Arpaia and Don Suarez are doing in the field on salinity tolerance. And so the background of what he provided gives you a better perspective of why we're doing what we're doing and how it's evolving. I'm sorry, I'm standing in people's ways. So the salinity team, can everybody hear me in the back? Is it okay? Okay, I'm the Director of Agricultural Operations, which means I oversee 2 research stations in Riverside. One's in Riverside proper in the campus, and the other one is out in the Coachella Valley. I'm also a subtropical horticulture extension specialist. Some of you have known me for many years, and I've been in different capacities within cooperative extension, but I've always been focused on subtropicals, and I had a few years where I was strictly administrative, and it's really good not to be strictly administrative. Mary Lou Arpaia is also a subtropical horticulture specialist, and her expertise is very broad, and she's bringing a unique her perspective of crop production and needs to this trial. Don Suarez is a soil scientist, and he specializes in salinities at the salinity lab at UCR, but he really focuses on the soil. So you take me and Mary Lou, which are more plant-based, Don is soil-based, and then you bring David in, which blends all the team together because he's an expert both in the plant aspect and the soil aspect, so it's really a great team. So the problem isn't anything that you haven't heard about. Our water quality is diminishing with the onset of subsequent drought years and overdrafting of groundwater, the shifting of water from city municipalities to take water and reclaim it and deliver it to growers. Irvine Ranch in Orange County, they're mandated to receive reclaimed water. And reclaimed water has got variable qualities. pH can be an issue, but mainly the salinity levels tend to be much higher. They are able to blend to some degree, but that again is going to vary over time, and so it impacts production. Avocado is a very sensitive plant to saline conditions, and David did a wonderful job illustrating that. You'll get yield losses at levels above 0.75 EC and 100 parts per million of chloride. So saline irrigation water is a common problem throughout California, and so we need to find out how we can successfully grow avocado and get the yields that we need to pay for the water that we use, and which is substandard water. So we're making progress. So what does high salinity and chloride do? It reduces yield, it reduces tree size, chlorophyll content, photosynthesis is reduced, root growth is reduced, and you get premature leaf drop from the leaf scorch. So all of those factors are not a very pretty picture. This is a picture from our salinity trial at Riverside, and those are the predominant symptoms. There's a leaf burn on the edges of the leaf, which is due to the chloride concentrating on the edges. You can see we had a nice fall flush of leaves, and so those are clean and growing, but we're going to lose the older leaves that have that much scorch. This is a photo that was taken out of actually I got it from Mary Lou Arpaia, but it came from a paper that was published in around the 1960s. And on the left side is chloride and how it accumulates on the margin of the leaves. And the top part is a radio-labeled chloride. The top on the right is a sodium-labeled chloride, and you can see how it's distributed through the leaf differently. So you can look at a leaf and know if you have a very good idea if you're dealing with sodium toxicity or chloride toxicity just because of the pattern of where the ions are deposited on the leaf. Now the specific effects of salinity, we have ion toxicity, which results in leaf burn. You have reduced photosynthesis and root growth. And the reduction of root growth has a compounding impact because you have reduced nutrient uptake, you have reduced water uptake, and you'll have reduced phytophthora resistance. Now the phytophthora resistance, that's still sort of a question mark. There's a lot of assumptions and reasonable assumptions because phytophthora in other crops, high salinity predisposes a plant to be more susceptible to phytophthora. That hasn't been proven in avocado, but it's a reasonable assumption. Now, how do we deal with the challenge of salinity? And David went through this with the irrigation frequency, pulsing irrigation to improve leaching. In fact, when he mentioned the Tule Lake area, I previously was in the Sacramento Basin, and the Delta, that's how they leach the salts in the Delta region, is they do pulses and a series of flushes, and you needed to flood and drain 3 times to get a lot of the salts out. So it's a very similar approach. Long-term strategies, the scion HAS is very sensitive to chlorides, to salts. So you'll see if you had a variety trial of just the scion, the HAS would show the symptoms very strongly. Combine that with rootstocks that may not be discriminating the uptake of sodium and chloride, and you have a combination of a susceptible rootstock or a rootstock that's predisposing the scion to, or uptaking the salts to the scion, you're ending up with a crop that is compromised. So if we could get improved rootstocks, and if we had a HAS-like scion that was more salt tolerant, what a great future we might have. So for our perspective, and the focus of this research was to look at the tolerant rootstocks, which are needed to maintain a yield. Now the search for rootstocks has been ongoing for many, many years. Dr. Abraham Benyakov in Israel searched worldwide for materials, and he developed some that is used more in Israel, but also identified VC material. And the VC stands for vegetative clones, so they're clonal. Seedlings, you have a lot of variability because the parentage of that seed, you don't know who the pollen parent is. So you're going to have variability of any seed for a rootstock, where if you use clonal, you have 100% of the same rootstock in the field. And so he developed a number of VC materials, and they're used as clonal rootstocks, and we have some that we were able to add to this trial. As a general rule, and you can see this in the field with the VC collections that we have, West Indian materials are more tolerant to salinity. The Mexican material is more sensitive, but there's a lot of variability. And the VCs that Benyakov had collected and cloned, you can see that some of them are West Indian and some of them are Mexican just by going out and looking at the leaf and the texture, smell, architecture. Now, this is a slide that came out of the Irvine station, and they're looking at different rootstocks. And this is before they started using reclaimed water. So the water is perfect. There's no root rot. The perfect environment for production of avocados. And Borchard does extremely well in this situation. Borchard wouldn't necessarily be the best rootstock elsewhere, but for this situation, it performed very well. You can look all the way to the right, you have the G755s. and those were developed by Zentmeyer. They had phenomenal resistance to Phytophthora, and so he took them to yield for a short number of years. The focus was on resistance to Phytophthora, not in terms of productivity of the plant. And the point of this slide is we have to go a long time with a rootstock trial to know that we have a keeper, because the G755 never produced. Even in a Phytophthora infested soils, you had huge, beautiful trees, but very little yield. And of course, big, beautiful trees are great for landscape. So our trial is new. It hasn't been around very long. We're starting to get yield, and we have preliminary information, but in order to take something and deliver it to a grower and have confidence that it's going to solve problems, it needs to go for more than a few years. And in case of G755, they went 10 years, and it was less than half the yield of Duke 7. Now, the background of this field plot, issues create opportunities. And we have had an opportunity to put in a rootstock trial based on, well, the rootstock trial was put into place, but the opportunity to make it a salinity trial is based on the circumstances. So in April 2011, a researcher at UCR planted a rootstock trial with the intent of inoculating half the trial with Phytophthora cinnamomi and the other half not. Now, you know from your own orchards that if you have Phytophthora, you don't even want to walk through into an uninfested grove because the fungus moves quite well. It's a water fungus. If you have water that moves, it moves with the water. Our irrigation system at UCR has rainwater recapture, and it's circulated back in. So you have 440 acres, and you have just a little bit of Phytophthora, but we have 60 acres of avocados that suddenly become at risk. So he intended to inoculate it. The project had been approved, and fortunately, I came on board and said, wait a minute, we can't inoculate this field. It will spread to all the other avocado collections. We can't take that risk. And so that researcher said, fine. It was just a nice opportunity to do a inoculated and non-inoculated trial, but we can do that elsewhere. So he didn't mind. He walked away from the trial, and we looked at it and said, with diminishing water quality, with the need for Phytophthora-resistant rootstocks, let's take this trial and make it a salinity trial. Now, there are consequences of making it a salinity trial because we're salinizing the soils, and those will be salinized soils from here on out. But we're not going to get away from the need to do research on saline soils. We also don't have a lack of need to do Phytophthora research, but the salt's not going to spread. So in 2012, the funding was approved in November of 2012. So the research started in 2013. We started converting it into a rootstock salinity trial. Now, unfortunately, the trial was set up as completely randomized. So that half of the room was all randomized, 13 rootstocks. It was going to be inoculated, and this half was randomized completely, no blocks. So we had to make the best of the situation because you need to have blocks. You need to have replications, not just individual trees, but blocks of trees across the field so that you can account for soil variability, uniformity of irrigation water. You need to block it. And so we were able to pare it down and make specific rows salinized rather than doing an entire half of the field. So the objectives of this study were to compare the Phytophthora root rot tolerant varieties from UCR in South Africa and obtain data that can to help us identify actual differences in salinity tolerance and hopefully get down to some mechanisms of salinity tolerance so we can do a better job selecting in the future. We're comparing the yield, and it's only at one salinity level. We made the field so that we can add salinity levels, but the funding was approved to do a comparison between fresh water and saline. And then our goal is to refine the current models for total water demand to produce high yields in relation to rootstock selection and irrigation quality. So this is, we built a very large irrigation tank, and so that contains salt water that's 10x, and then we inject it into the irrigation system so that as a field is irrigated, the salinized rows get 10% of the salt, which brings it up to 1.5 EC. We have the UC varieties, PP 14, 24, 4, 45, and 40. The first three are already patented, so that's Uzi, Stedham, and Zentmeyer. And then Thomas, Dusa were the standards. And of course, keep in mind that I inherited what was already there. So those may not be the best comparisons industry-wise other than Dusa. There should have been a Duke 7 in there. Toro Canyon would have been great to have in there, but that wasn't in the root rot program's planning. So we have what we have. There were 6 new South African varieties that the researcher was able to import, and then we added, a year later, ungrafted VCs that Reuben Hofsche donated. Now those are ungrafted. He had these trees. It's a long story that's really not relevant, but he was able to acquire enough trees, but they weren't grafted, but we said, let's just see how they perform. We can't do a direct comparison, but we can compare within those VCs as to what's going to be tolerant. So it's a randomized block design with at least 5 reps per rootstock. Some have more, but none of them have less. We installed decagon probes, and that's David's been working with the decagon probes to do real-time measurements. And we've been implementing the salinity treatment. Before implementing the salinity treatment, we did some baseline measurements. So we looked at leaf analysis, soil analysis, measured resistivity, can never say that word, across the field, as well as photosynthetic measurements. And the treatments were a control, which is high quality groundwater. It's the Gauge Water Canal in Riverside, and it averages 0.67 EC and 40 parts per million chloride. And then the corresponding treatment would be a high EC or sort of a high to moderate chloride. So the EC is 1.5 and the chloride is 175 parts per million. Now we're modifying the irrigation using calcium, sodium chloride, sodium sulfate. I'll show you the exact recipe on the next slide, but we're using a blend of salts, and we're using an extract chem model to prepare them to get to the right desired EC. So we're not doing reclaimed water. We're trying to model water that's high in salinity. So, because reclaimed water is going to have a lot of other stuff that's not necessarily proportional to what you're going to get out of groundwater that's highly saline, or irrigation project, the Colorado River water, for instance. So we wanted to model what is realistically high salt water, but not necessarily reclaimed. Our leaching practices, we're monitoring the salinity levels carefully and adjusting to push the accumulated salts away from the root zone. And we're trying to prevent high salts from moving into the root zone by irrigating after rain events. Now, in general, if you have less than an inch of rainfall, you need to irrigate to flush it out. More than that is enough water to move the salts away, generally speaking, but you'll see that it's not always the case. Some of the common salinizing salts that we incorporated would be sodium, calcium, magnesium, which are cations, positively charged ions, and then the anions are chloride, sulfate, and bicarbonate. So this is our recipe, and it pretty well models what Colorado River water would be, which is higher in salinity, and then we boosted the chloride because that's the kicker for avocados. And so we wanted to have a blend of salts, which is realistic, but we also want to focus on the impact of the chloride. Now the treatment schedule, we needed to wait till fall to start injecting the salts. We didn't need to, but we didn't want to kill the plants outright in the month of July. So to give them a shock when they've been under high quality irrigation water and then suddenly salinize them, and we wanted to keep the trial for a long time. So we started in November after as you saw on David's slide, the ET starts to drop in the fall. So that's when we started salinizing. We started at about 25% of the final concentration. And 2 months later, we gave them the full treatment. So January 17th, 2014. So they've only been salinized for really 11 months now. Full treatment at the 1.5 EC, 175 parts per million chloride. The trees we use, the irrigation scheduling, we use a calculator that David showed on his slide, which is at avocadosource.com, and we're using a 20% leaching fraction. Now the field trial, we're taking root cores to measure how much, soil cores to measure the root mass, measuring trunk and canopy diameters. And those measurements on a young tree are quite variable. So I won't be presenting that data because they're young trees and you don't really see huge canopy differences until a little bit closer to maturity. We're looking at chloride injury symptoms, leaf analysis, flower intensity and timing, as well as yield. We're measuring physiological effects on photosynthesis and stomatoconductance. And then when a tree dies, we're doing destructive sampling to see if the calcium and chloride were excluded by the roots. Now, David covered this very well. We prepared our slide sets independent of one another, not knowing what each other was going to talk about, and we have very little overlap, which is quite beautiful. But the question came in my mind is, here we're talking about EC, so what is EC and how do you measure it? And the salinity pen that David was talking about is what I have in my lab, and it's beautiful because you're making a saturated soil extract, and when you measure EC in that context, it's accounting for soil texture. So you can make that comparison on Carl's ranch, and you could go over to David's ranch, and the measurement for EC would be the same, relevant to the soil type. So you can make comparisons across your ranch and know what the EC level is and not have to discount if it's a sandy soil or a loam. And Don Suarez has developed the technology and purchased the equipment to measure the resistance, the electrical resistance across a field. And what this does is they have about 86 probes going down this vineyard. We do this in the avocados, but this is a easier way to show it because the vines are defoliated at this point and you can see where the probes are going. So he measures the electrical conductance between probes going down the road and across the road, so you can see the profile of where the salts are. And so before the research started, he profiled 4 rows. And you can see the yellow, I believe the red is higher EC. Can you read that? Anyway, you can see the profile between yellow and red is the gradient of salts. And on the research that he was doing with the vineyard, which is even much higher salinity levels, you could see where the tree was, where the emitter was, and where the salt zone was going away from it. And you can build 3D pictures of this. So they've been doing this multiple times a year and just monitoring the salinity phase within the soil at different depths. We also did a pre-treatment leaf analysis, and we know that rootstocks vary in their ability to take up nutrients. We know that there are differences, and so we needed a baseline of what those differences were before we started injecting saline water. So these are examples with DUSA, the PP1424, PP4, which is Zentmeyer, and SA6, which is, the South Africans refer to it as RO06. But you can see there are differences. The DUSA has a higher calcium content. That's important. Calcium is very important in the plant's ability to handle salinity. So just as a baseline, DUSA has an advantage going into this trial. looking at sodium Zentmeyer, which has been, some of the rootstock trials have indicated that it is more sensitive to saline soils. And the sodium here is clearly higher in the Zentmeyer, which is PP4. And then looking at potassium, which is important in the plant's ability to regulate water status within the plant. And you have very similar between many of them, and then the PP24 and the SA6 are a much higher level of potassium. So these are just examples of differences pre-treatment. We're doing the leaf analysis right now, which would be relevant to the 10, 11 months of salinization, but those results aren't ready yet. So we also did a comparison across the field on fresh versus salinity to see if there were differences down the row. This is before we injected the salts, but we want to make sure everything was uniform before we started, and it was. Now the results, we found that once we started injecting salts, the field was essentially instantly salinized. There wasn't a transitionary phase. With boron, which takes time for it to accumulate, you have to pre-saturate and get the boron levels up if you're doing boron research. But with the saline, the soils were almost instantly salinized. So there, from the point of full salinization in January on, that status hasn't changed. In the top 20 centimeters in the fresh treatment, the EC is about 1.4, and the top 20 centimeters in the saline irrigated row is 2.5. Now we have 1.5 EC water going on, but salts are accumulating in spite of the leaching. So the salinity levels are going to be higher than what your water is. It'd be nice if it wasn't. Before salinization, now this photo, I unfortunately didn't take it on the exact angle, but you have, this is before the treatment and this is after, and you can see this tree is the same as this tree. So we had what you call a flash burn, what David referred to as a flash burn. And it's quite dramatic to go out and look at the condition of the trees. One of the factors in that flash burn is we had 2 inches of rain in September. And 2 inches should be enough that you don't need to follow immediately with an irrigation. And that's an error, because of that 2 inches in an hour, how much of it really penetrates? Probably less than an inch. And so we should have immediately followed with an irrigation. We delayed a few days, and in the meanwhile, those salts moved in the root zone. So this became a worst case scenario for some of those rootstocks, which is good, because now that could happen in any field. You might not be able to get there in time to get the irrigation on, or to be able to irrigate through a rain event. And so we want to make sure we have rootstocks, not that we designed it this way, but it's serendipitous to know that large rain events where you didn't follow with an irrigation, the salts moved into the root zone and fried some trees. Fried selected rootstocks, not all of them. So we have examples like here is Dusa, and this was 10 months after the saline treatments, so this is in October, and the salt's on the left and the fresh is on the right. And you see tip burn on the fresh. Again, those rain events, if we'd followed with an irrigation, even in the fresh you got some tip burn. This is PP40, and if you look at it, it looks a little bit thin, and some of it's the angle of the photo. The data shows that the fresh and the salt are almost equal. The picture shows the fresh being a little thinner. And this is the Zentmeyer. And unfortunately, Zentmeyer is a great rootstock. And Zentmeyer was a phenomenal researcher. And we need to find a rootstock that is saline tolerant and root rot tolerant and rename it. And I know you can't use the word Zentmeyer again, but we need to find a way of using Zentmeyer's name on a rootstock that is phenomenal, because this isn't going to work in saline conditions. Now this is in February 2014, looking at Hass leaf burn across treatments. All the rootstocks are averaged together. And you can see that it's kind of an even distribution. You have low water demand, it's February. The trees had only been fully salinized, the soil had only been fully salinized for 1 month. And so it was kind of a nice picture. Now you look in October and see our damage rating only goes to 3 here. When you go to October, 10 months later, or roughly 10 months after salinization, you have a lot of 5s, which is nearly dead, if not dead. 5 is the most severe treatment. Most of them are 90% defoliated. So you can see the range of the change between the two measurements. And looking at damage rating of selected rootstocks, we have DUSA does really well. PP40, which isn't patented yet, it does very well as well. And then compare that to the RO16 from South Africa, and those trees are gone. There's no hope for that selection. There are some South African selections that are very good, but I wanted to contrast something that was not so good. And then the VCs, this is combining all the VCs, and I think there's 6 VCs. And they're averaging them, looking at the fresh versus the salt, and you have a range of good and bad. And if you look at it more closely and look at just 2 of the selections, and 804 is very good in this case, but Ruben has another one that's from Israel. They're all the VCs are from Israel, but he has another one that's been widely planted in Israel that we need to test here. That is better than 804. But you can see 804, the fresh, there's absolutely no leaf burn, and they're ungrafted. And even in the salt, the majority of the trees have very minimal leaf burn. And I contrast that with the VC40, which doesn't do well under saline conditions. Now, one other parameter that we're looking at is physiologically. What's happening to that plant? Is it photosynthesizing well? Are the stomates open or closed? It's hard to do, especially under stress. The stomates close. Under heat stress, they close. So there's a very short window of opportunity to measure in Riverside, which is hotter than Oxnard, hotter than most avocado areas. And so we go out from about somewhere around 8 or 9 in the morning to about 10:30, those trees are cranking. And so it's very short term. We focused on 4 different varieties to do comparisons. And we looked at different measurements to look at how the plants are responding. So the higher the number, the better the tree is performing. So we have DUSA and R005, which is very good. And they're doing photosynthetically, they are right on. And this is only the saline treatment. And you compare that to the Zentmeyer PP4, and it by far is the least. We wanted to repeat this, and unfortunately, most of PP4 is no longer with us, and so we couldn't repeat the saline treatments. In terms of water use efficiency, you look at intercellular CO2, and again, but it's a converse. The lower the number, the better the water use efficiency. So DUSA and DUSA is by far the best, and Zentmeyer is by far the worst. So there are significant differences in the saline treatments, but there were no significant differences between the fresh treatments. So all those trees do great under freshwater conditions. They're photosynthetically, they're responding well. There's no serious stresses. But once you add the saline, you divide the trees up between performers and non-performers. And lastly, we're looking at yield. And this yield is really, think back to when the saline was injected. It fully salinized in February. So that crop had already been set 10 months before. So these trees, for all practical purposes, it's not saline that's impacting them. Maybe a little bit toward the end where you're getting more sizing. So we looked at fruit weight and also number. And just looking at fruit weight, the DUSA is by far the largest and the heaviest fruit on those of all the rootstocks. So that's just a range. And that's only the salinity treatment. So since the treatments weren't implemented until the crop was set, this is a skewed look at it. But it gives you an idea at year 3, which is still very young trees, what to expect on yield under these situations. There was significant difference in fruit number and total weight harvested, and DUSA by far outshined. So our conclusions so far, this is all very preliminary. If we were to give this talk next year, I would have a whole lot more information to give. But we really wanted to let you know what your research dollars are doing, and there's hope for good rootstocks in the future. We know there's differences, and there's potential for the rootstocks and tolerance to salinity. We're finding that some are very intolerant, and intolerant is probably too soft of a word. And then preliminarily, there's differences in use of water use efficiency as well as other physiological parameters. And those are important in terms of making decisions on which rootstocks to go forward with in terms of a selection process. Our long-term deliverables, we want to be able to provide you with a list of rootstocks. Our next step is to take the rootstocks that are performing well and put them out into regional trials and get your growing conditions. You guys are doing a better job growing trees than we are. And you're doing all of you have different practices, so we want to get that data from how that rootstock performs under different circumstances, different environments and different management. And then provide recommendations on how to water, how to leach, at what point do you need to be leaching, and how we can improve the system so that we can deal with saline water. In October of this year, the Avocado Society brought part of their annual meeting. They came to UCR and we did a tour through the different parts of the research station, and we walked through the salinity trial, and they got to see the soil resistivity work of Don Suarez, and David gave a talk on irrigation management, and we walked through the varieties and looked at the differences, and then looked at the other collections on the station. And it's something that we would like to do. We'd like to bring people in and show them what we're doing. Once we advance it to regional trials, then there'll be less travel. And along the lines of this field tour, every year we host a citrus day. And so in this coming January 29th, we'll be having Citrus Day in Riverside, and we'll be covering topics like Asian citrus psyllid Huanglong bean sampling, how to sample, what the detection methods are, new varieties, weed management, water irrigation management. So those are topics that we'll be doing. So if you're interested, January 29th is the day. Next year we hope to host a tour also of the avocado trial. October is a good month to do that. You see strong differences in the trees. Hopefully they'll still be alive. Some of them will be. Yes. Any questions?
Can this type of research be used to negotiate maximum salinity levels on reclaimed water, or are those decisions made based on other measurements or costs to the reclamation process?
Well, data from this trial will be helpful, but we're only looking at one salinity level. In order to be able to give a maximum, we need to be looking at multiple levels. And what we did, we had proposed a trial with a control and 2 or 3 different salinity levels. And what was funded, I mean, it was expensive to build the equipment and put everything in. And, you know, it's okay to proceed slowly. So we went with two levels, but we have room to grow. And those are the situations that you really need to have in order to help inform those that are developing policy. Can you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that this is possible for the future. We could look at improving salinity tolerance, but in terms of negotiating, we have 80% of the industry is on non-clonal Mexican rootstocks. And so there's no way that we could go to higher salinity levels than what we're tolerating right now and have continued production. We're already dealing with yield losses, so going higher than 100 would be detrimental. I think having There's not a lot of published data out there right now on the chloride tolerance of different rootstocks. And the water management districts are all looking for information that they can use to say that we should have higher chloride levels. With good management techniques, possibly we can endure the 100. But I'd say going above that level at this point would just be asking for trouble for the entire industry.
What are the considerations to adding Toro Canyon, which is obviously a very popular and commonly used rootstock?
Well, the VCs aren't, what we need to do is what we're thinking about doing is taking out the trees that aren't performing. So there's 3 or 4 different varieties that aren't performing. And then it's essentially a subset of a new experiment where we can do comparisons. To the VCs we can compare amongst themselves and they're ungrafted, so the data we're getting is data, but it's not going to tell you how HAS is going to do on those rootstocks, and we know HAS is sensitive. It's just an indicator of those rootstocks. So it was an opportunity to add something that we could get some information out, but we can't make a direct comparison. And if we're doing a new experiment, we would add Toro Canyon. And unfortunately, the original researcher didn't include Toro Canyon because that to me is a big oversight. But so in the future, we would do that. If we did trials in regional trials, we'd include the industry standards in those trials.
Are you still doing some other studies on testlike varieties for tolerance, or is that?
Mary Lou Arpaia is a researcher that is in charge of the breeding program, and she has some very nice materials coming along that are in tier 3 testing, and the next tier would be, I think it'd be release. She needs data on post-harvest performance of some of these, and anecdotally in the field, like at South Coast, which uses reclaimed water, she can see what the response is. So she's getting some information on, and many of them are more salinity tolerant, though, and I don't know the number of the avocado that she really prefers. That everybody prefers it, eats really well, but she needs to continue those trials, and so that becomes an issue with funding. And so if you're interested, she has tastings once a month, and you can come to Riverside it's actually tomorrow. She does a tasting, and you can come and see those any month and have a feel for what is coming out of her program, and then talk to your avocado commission on what your interests are. There's questions on who wants new varieties. Do the packers want new varieties? Is it the nurseries that don't want them? The growers want variety because it helps you fill the gaps over time. But I don't know where the blockage is in terms of getting new materials released, if it's the nurseries that aren't interested or they are interested. So it's more complex than just having funding for Mary Lou. HAS doesn't always come in first place, no. In fact, this one often outperforms HAS.
Looking ahead, how far down the road in years before we have the silver bullet? We have something that's exceptionally better than what we have right now as a choice
For
to
rootstock.
apply. And let me follow that up, because I'm motivated by 2 things. One, I look around this room and I think I see quite a bit of gray hair and even some no hair on one hand, yet Dave just said that it caught my attention that 80% of avocados raised in California are on Mexican rootstocks. Those are going to be turned over and so forth. So we've got 2 things.
We have opportunities. I know that from this trial, I would hope that they would advance PP40 and maybe PP45, and I know those are planted in other root rot trials, so we can have other looks at that. And I think the patenting of the rootstocks is certainly faster than the patenting of scions of new varieties. I can't give you a feel for years, but the VCs, some of the VCs have historically performed well in other countries, and those we need to be putting in here. So that's Ruben's going to donate several that are grafted this time, so we can compare a mini trial within our trial and look at grafted VCs because that has the most potential. I think there are nurseries that have some of the VCs ready to go. It's just I don't know which one, and certainly there is a variability in their performance, as you saw. So I can't give you a solid answer, but it is in the near future.
A range, near future, 5 years, 10 years?
I would say under 10.
Under 10.
What would you say?
I'd hope it'd be closer to 5.
Yeah. It's being taped. I didn't want to say 5.
Peggy referred to lack of funding for Mary Lou's new variety research program. In case the audience was not aware, the commission is not funding any longer that part of the breeding program. They've chosen to continue with the rootstock breeding program, but not so much variety breeding.
We've been having conversations with them, and there is more interest. I don't see that it's going to be fully funded because their focus right now is rootstocks, and the variety improvement program is very expensive. There's many different collections that have to be maintained, and water costs at Irvine are probably higher than here. Per acre foot of water, I would say it's in the $700 range. And so the cost of water just to keep the trees alive is huge. And so that's a huge burden on the Avocado Commission. But in conversations that we've been having with Tom Bellamore, there's changes in their position.
Just to expound on that a bit, this research has gone on for years, and a lot of funds have been invested in it, and it is going to be lost. So if you know who your avocado commissioner, your representative is, might be appropriate to say something.
I don't think at one point I heard them say, just shut the water off. And that I think is just a knee-jerk reaction. I don't think they'll be shutting the water off, but they need some help in supporting those. And I know that Mary Lou and the university is looking at other partners to help with those costs. For the citrus variety collection in Riverside, there's 1,000 different citrus types, and there's no funds to support that. But Tracy Kahn, who's in charge of that, has been able to develop relationships with different companies. In this case, it was Gibbonon. So she has $1 million foundation that's been built up from industry funds, industry external to us, because they can use that collection to develop flavors. And there's perfume industries. Of course, we don't have avocado perfume, but we have avocado oils. There's cosmetic industries. And so we need to be thinking more externally as to how we can support these collections without having to tax you guys, because it's your dollars that are supporting the Avocado Commission. So it's a work in progress, but in the meanwhile, we need to keep the trees alive. And I would hate to see the tier 3 things not progress, because there's some very interesting prospects in there.
What is the when you find a tree that's tolerant, what is the mechanism? Does it just not absorb the chlorides, or does it not the salts, or does it not metabolize them in a way? You said something like Hass. If you had a tree that didn't get tip burn, would it still have the salts in it? And if it's not absorbing it in the ground, are you you don't get a good leaching rain or anything, are you kind of building up a whole bank down there in the soil of chlorides that might hit a threshold?
Well, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing destructive sampling after a tree dies, to see if the roots are excluding those ions or if they're being pulled into the plant, and looking through the wood and the leaves are gone, but we can look to see where it's compartmentalized in the tree. So there's different mechanisms, and there's not going to be any one. And in some cases, it may be as simple as calcium content, nutritional content status of the tree, and its ability to withstand the salinity. David, do you want to add?
Yes, I think you touched on the main points there. The exclusion mechanism is the main one that they look at for plant tolerance, because there are chloride transporters that can send the chloride back out. There's both directions that this can move into the plant. So the ability to exclude the chloride is the primary mechanism. But then, again, how that's affected by hypoxia, susceptibility to this, the integrity of the root membrane. I think there's a lot of questions. When you look at reviews on chloride, you can, some of these things go on for 40 or 50 pages talking about calcium interactions, sodium interactions, signaling, hormones. It gets really, really complicated in terms of the overall process. But the basic thing is exclusion.
Well, again, thank you for coming and hearing us out, and your feedback is wonderful, and we look forward to inviting you to Riverside.
Okay, so thank you again, Dr. Mauk, for that presentation on salinity tolerance and avocado rootstocks. This discussion, just to summarize, talked about how water quality is a perennial issue in California agriculture, and that avocados are particularly sensitive to this quality. It's manifest through, most notably, leaf burn and retarded root growth. In 2013, UCR decided to convert what was proposed as a Phytophthora trial. They converted that from the Phytophthora trial into a salinity trial, where they are contrasting high-quality water from the Gage Canal with water that is set up to be replicate the quality of water coming out of the Colorado River, with different cations and anions in the total salinity. They're then measuring salinity above and below 20 centimeters in the soil, and looking at various rootstocks and how they respond to that, notably the Thomas, Dusa, and several selections from the Volcani Institute and Zentmeyer selections. We have 1 year of data, and hopefully that will continue. So thank you.